World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. Welcome back. Another luncheon presentation here in the middle of July, the 14th here. Great speaker lined up today. We're a little bit tight on time. We're not going to have the full hour to 75 minutes. We're going to be wrapped up here by about 12:45. So without any delay, I'm going to get David Bean here, our Vice President of the World Affairs Council, to introduce our speaker. David.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. Special welcome to Becca Pincus, who joins us today to talk about a topic that we have not dealt with before, emerging great power competition in the Arctic. Becca is an assistant professor in the Strategic and Operational Research Department of the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College, and is a member of the Institute for Future Warfare Studies within the college. She previously served as primary investigator at the U.S. Coast Guard Center for Arctic Study and Policy, located at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Becca obtained her bachelor's degree from Georgetown and her master's and doctorates from the University of Vermont. So without further ado, I welcome Becca Pincus to present to us today. Becca?
Hi, David. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks, Mike. Thank you to the World Affairs Council. I'm looking forward to speaking with you all today. I'm going to start sharing slides in just a minute, but I just wanted to let you know that although I am an employee of the U.S. Navy and the Department of Defense, I'm sharing with you my personal opinions. I am not providing the official views or positions of the Navy or the Department of Defense. So I just need to establish that right up front. I am going to go into sharing now, and hopefully you will begin to see my slides. Please shout, put a hand up if you do not see them. So I'm looking forward to talking to you today about climate change and what's going on with geopolitics in the Arctic region. As my intro mentioned, we've got a little short for time, so I'm going to try and go through these slides fairly quickly and then make some time for Q&A towards the middle of the hour. So why are we talking about the Arctic region? I'm sure you're all aware that the Arctic is melting, and it's melting in ways that are remarkable and unprecedented in the human experience. So the slide that you're looking at right now has two graphs on it. On the upper right, you can see the average monthly sea ice extent. And that is just a straight drop down. So the Arctic region is losing about 10% of its sea ice every decade, and it's in precipitous one-way decline. The graph on the upper left of your screen shows some colors in the Arctic sea ice cap. The reds and oranges are thicker, older, what is called multi-year sea ice. And you can see that we've lost almost all of that thick, old ice. And what's left now is thinner ice. It's what's called first-year ice. So it's just the ice that freezes up each winter. And so that brings me to the points at the bottom of the screen here. The sea ice is melting in a couple of different ways. So it's covering less geographic territory. It's melting in space. So it's shrinking in space. There's less extent of sea ice than there used to be. And it's becoming thinner, because the old sea ice, the multi-year ice, was really thick, many, many feet thick, very hard to break. And that's gone now, and what's left is much thinner first-year ice, which is much easier to break. And it's also shrinking in time. So there is a shorter and shorter season of ice coverage. And there's more and more open water in the summertime for a longer period of time. So we can say that Arctic sea ice is shrinking in three dimensions: in space, in depth, and time. And the ice retreat is happening faster than most of our models had predicted. So our our satellite observations of Arctic sea ice extent, and on the top left there is, satellite picture. Those satellite observations tell us that the ice retreat is happening faster than we had expected. And that's scary because we thought we would have more time for this change, but it means that climate change is happening in the Arctic really, really fast. The Arctic region has already warmed by 2 degrees Celsius. So it's warming faster than the rest of the globe. Climate change is happening faster in the Arctic than anywhere else. One of the reasons climate change is happening so fast in the Arctic is because if you think about what the region looked like, it's an ocean, right? A small ocean that used to be covered with sea ice. And sea ice is bright, white, and shiny. It reflects solar radiation back off the surface of the ice. It bounces the sun's rays back off and back out into space. And when you take that bright white sea ice and you replace it with dark blue ocean water, which is what happens when sea ice melts, that dark blue ocean water, instead of bouncing solar radiation back off it, soaks it up, because ocean water is dark blue, dark colors are very. And so incoming solar radiation in the Arctic region is increasingly being soaked up by open water, which makes warming happen even faster. So there's a positive feedback loop happening in the Arctic region as sea ice is replaced with water. And that is what we call Arctic amplification, this positive feedback. And that's one of the reasons the region is warming so fast. So if anyone has any questions, let me know. I'm happy to talk about this further, but the points that I want you to take away is that the region is warming much faster than anywhere else on Earth. It's happening faster than we thought it would, and it's happening in lots of different kinds of ways. Okay, here's a map of the Arctic region, so you can see what we're talking about. And the Arctic Circle, that blue circle on the map there, is 66.5 degrees north. That's what we think of as the Arctic Circle. And you can see that there are 8 states present in this region. So there's 8 states that lie around the Arctic Ocean. And so you can see Russia on the right there in yellow. Russia is the largest Arctic state. Very clear, right? It's got about half of the Arctic coastline. And then if we work our way up counterclockwise, you can see the United States. That's Alaska. So the United States is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. Then you see Canada. Then you see Greenland. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Then at the very bottom of the Arctic Circle there in the North Atlantic is Iceland. And then we see Norway, Sweden, and Finland. So those are the 8 Arctic states. There are 2 major organizations that bring these 8 states together to talk about issues of shared interest. Those are the Arctic Council, which does primarily governance issues, environmental protection, advocating for the rights of the indigenous people in the region. And then there's the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And the Coast Guard Forum brings together the coast guards of these 8 states to work on combating environmental pollution and search and rescue in the maritime domain. Russia is the chair of both of them and took over that chair in May of this year, so just a couple of months ago. And the chairmanship doesn't Russia any special powers. These are both consensus-based organizations, which means that all 8 states have to agree to take any action. But it does mean that Russia will be hosting of these organizations for the next 2 years. The Arctic region thaws, and as that sea ice retreats, shipping lanes are being opened up across the Arctic Ocean, and it's getting a lot of attention. I would say that there's probably more attention, more smoke than fire right now, because these shipping lanes are still very, very dangerous, and they're not commercially very viable. But let's talk about them for a minute, and we can always talk about them more during the Q&A. So on the left-hand side of the screen in red is the Northwest Passage. That cuts across Canada's northern coastline. And you can see it's got a couple different channels there going through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. In the middle, in green, is something called the Transpolar Route. That is a future route. It's not open yet. That would just go straight across the middle of the Arctic. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, blue is the Northern Sea that runs across Russia's northern coastline. And again, you can see there's a couple of different channels that take you either inside those islands. Both straight lines around the island in the, and they say that everything inside those straight baselines are internal waters, including these shipping lanes. The United States disagrees with that interpretation, and we say that both of these shipping passages, the Northwest Passage, sea route, are in fact international straits. And those are terms, internal waters versus international straits are terms in international law that carry different types of obligations and permissions for states to drive ships through them. And we can talk about that a bit more if you're interested, but basically it means that Canada and Russia are making more aggressive claims to regulating maritime traffic through these shipping routes than the United States agrees with. And so those are 2 points of disagreement among the US and Canada and Russia in the Arctic. Now, as I said, these shipping lanes are not getting a lot of use. So this is not a very important issue from a shipping perspective. The Northwest Passage, what you can see with all of those islands there, is one of the places where the Arctic sea ice is hanging on the longest. And so these are still very dangerous. There's still a lot of ice there, and the Canadian government is not strongly interested in building out a lot of commercial shipping in this region. So the Northwest Passage is pretty quiet. The Russian government, on the other hand, is very, very interested in developing the Northern Sea Route. And they have put a lot of money into building it out, and they are building a lot of icebreakers that will help ship traffic get through the NSR. And they really, really want the NSR to be a major international seaway. So that's where most of the traffic is concentrated. It's also, so the sea ice is melting out in the NSR a little bit faster based on the dynamics of the Arctic Ocean itself. So there's more ship traffic through the Arctic, still quite low. It's about 50 million tons of ship traffic. They're trying to get it up to 90 million tons in the next couple of years. And in most of that is energy production, because Russia has a lot of energy reserves up in this area, oil and natural gas. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But these are the major shipping lanes. As I said before, that one in the middle, that wouldn't be open until later in the century. So right now it's not viable at all. There's still sea ice in the central Arctic Ocean. And one more point is that both of these freeze up in the wintertime. So the Arctic is still a cold, dark place that is covered in sea ice in the wintertime. In the summertime, we're seeing more and more ability to drive ships through the region, but in the wintertime, it's still largely impassable unless you have a very strong icebreaker. Okay. This graph is a little hard to read, and I will, I'm happy to talk more about it if anyone's interested. This is about international law. And so you can see the states in the region are in that kind of brownish yellow color. There are, again, we have states around the outside of the Arctic Ocean. And then there's a bunch of bright colors that surround all of the land masses. And the really bright colors are what's called an exclusive economic zone, an EEZ. And the EEZ is something that a coastal state can claim through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So it applies to the whole globe. States can claim a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. So the portion of the ocean right next to a coastal state's land boundary, you can push that out to 200 nautical miles, and within the EEZ, as the name implies, states have the exclusive right to all of the resources. So that's fish in the water column, and it's energy resources on the seabed. And so states can regulate economic activity in this zone and also environmental protection. It doesn't give them full sovereignty, but in terms of those environmental protection obligations and rights to natural resources, the EEZ is exclusive to that coastal state. And so the really bright colored areas, Greenland is a great example because you can see that really bright pink all the way around the outside of Greenland there. So that's Danish exclusive economic zone. And then you can see Canada's just to the left. And in that strait, the Nares Strait, where Canadian and Greenlandic territory comes together very close, you can see the two states have drawn that line right in the middle, and the EEZs get narrower, but they each have an equal amount. Under the terms of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, states can also claim something called Extended Continental Shelf. That's ECS. So I know there's a lot of acronyms. EEZ is Exclusive Economic Zone. That's the 200 nautical miles just off the coastline. That's fish in the water column, resources in the water column, and then things on the seafloor. The Extended Continental Shelf is a little bit different. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea enables states to make these ECS claims to parts of the seafloor that they can prove are extensions, natural prolongations of the continental shelf of the coastal state. So basically that means if the land mass of the coastal state is this, sloping ridge that runs out into the ocean, states can claim areas beyond 200 nautical miles if they can prove it's this natural prolongation. And the only thing that an ECS claim gets you as a coastal state are economic rights to the seabed. So you don't get any rights to the water column. The water column above the extended continental shelf is high seas. The seabed, if you can get this extended continental shelf claim to an extended portion of the shelf, you get seabed, which means you get rights to resources on or in the seabed. And so that's things like energy resources, oil and gas that might be lying under the seabed. It's also marine life that lives in the seabed, so things like clams that are attached to it. But it's just that seabed, and it's just an economic right. So if you look at this map, you can see the stripy bits in the center. That is the Central Arctic Ocean. And those stripy areas are where states are making extended continental shelf claims. And you can see that some of them are overlapping. And that's one of the really interesting things going on in the Arctic region right now, is that we have overlapping claims to the extended continental shelf in the Central Arctic Ocean, mostly to an area called the Lomonosov Ridge. And the Lomonosov Ridge runs right across the middle of the Arctic, basically from about the Canada-Greenland meet point all the way up towards Russia. And it's an underwater mountain chain. And in the center is the North Pole. And so Russia, Denmark, through Greenland, and Canada all have overlapping claims to the extended continental shelf in this area. Now, we're talking about, seabed mining or, very, 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 very far offshore oil and gas drilling in the Central Arctic Ocean, which is a very difficult area to operate. And so there is nothing in this area right now that is commercially viable. And there probably will not be for a long time, because this is a very expensive area to operate. And we're talking about areas that are way offshore and they're in deep water. So there is no company right now that wants to go out and mine the seabed of the Central Arctic Ocean. But there are these overlapping claims. And the way that they will be resolved, as laid out in the UN Convention, is through direct negotiations between Russia, Denmark, and Canada. So that's another interesting piece. You see a lot about sort of rush to claim the Arctic. And I would say that there is this overlapping claim going on to the ECS, but it is not an urgent one because these areas are not commercially viable. And there is an established process under international law for states to negotiate over them. And so far, Russia, which is probably the state of most concern in the Arctic, has been abiding by the processes laid out in the UN Convention. So they have been abiding by all of the scientific processes for submitting samples about their extended continental shelf claim. They've been doing scientific surveys, they've been releasing data, they have gone back and gotten more data. So they have not showed any signs that they are going to not continue to abide by international law in pursuing these claims. So that's really encouraging. Again, happy to talk more about that in Q&A, but for now I'm going to keep moving. There are two territorial disputes in the Arctic, neither of which are anything to worry about. They're both kind of fun. So in RA Strait, we looked at that area on the last map there. It's just the touch point at the very northern part of Greenland and the northern part of Canada where their two territories come together. There is a tiny little island called Hans Island. It is about, I think it's 40 acres, maybe 30. It's a tiny little island. It is barren and rocky. And Canada and Denmark do not agree on who owns it. And so that is the land dispute in the Arctic. There is an area of territorial disagreement between Canada and Denmark. It is a tiny island. There is nothing of value on that island. And obviously Canada and Denmark are close allies. So we don't really worry about Hans Island. In fact, the Danish and Canadian militaries periodically visit Hans Island to raise a flag, to establish their claim, and they often leave a case of either whiskey or schnapps for the other side. So it's a very friendly territorial dispute. There is another territorial dispute in the Arctic, which is a maritime dispute, and that's between the United States and Canada. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see that on the western part of that Northwest Passage in the Beaufort Sea, there is a small wedge of gray area where US waters and Canadian waters are adjacent. And that gray wedge is an area of territorial dispute between the United States and Canada because we do not have a settled maritime boundary in the Beaufort Sea. The United States and Canada disagree over that very small area of water. And that's because we use different methods for drawing our boundary north from the land into the ocean. So the United States draws the line in one way, and the Canadians are drawing it in the other way, and we have not yet been able to resolve this. It is a very small area. And again, it's not of commercial interest right now. So there's no sort of burning need to get it resolved. There's not a lot of traffic in that area, and there's not much going on. And the United States and Canada are incredibly close allies. So again, we don't really worry about that dispute too much. If anything comes up that would make it a burning issue, we can trust that the US and Canada will work out a negotiated agreement. So when we hear about Arctic boundary disputes, they're mostly not things that we need to worry about, which is great. We do hear a lot about Russia and China in the Arctic. And so that's the last thing that I want to talk about. They do have strong interests in the region. They're very different. So I will talk about Russia for a minute, and then I'll talk a little bit about China, and then I'll wrap up. So if you look at Russia, they, as we noted before, are the largest Arctic power. They have a huge amount of coastline in the Arctic region. And also it's important to note that Russia is a state that makes a lot of its income selling oil and increasingly natural gas. So most of Russia's hard currency is earned through exporting energy. And a lot of its future energy resources, a lot of its remaining to be developed resources are in the Arctic region. And that map at the upper left shows you oil and natural gas fields in the Arctic. And you can see they've got some very large deposits. And so when Russia looks to its economic future through this century and into the next, the Arctic is really where it's at, because most of the oil and gas in Russian territory that's easier to access has already been tapped. So most of their future resources are going to lie in this region. And so if you think about an economy that is largely based on selling oil and gas, that has drilled out most of their easy to access resources, and most of their remaining resources are in the Arctic, you can see that this region is of tremendous importance to Russia. It is a core national interest. It's their future economic prosperity. And so it's not surprising that they have been building out their military capabilities along the Arctic coastline and islands to secure these resources. And this is an area that for Russia was protected during the Cold War, although not that much because there was a lot of ice up there and it was pretty impassable. So Russia didn't really worry about enemies attacking it in the Arctic because it used to be very well protected. Now the Arctic is much more vulnerable because the sea ice is gone, and the Russians are inviting in a lot of international activity to help them drill for oil and gas and to ship along the Northern Sea Route. And the government had not made any investments in this region since the end of the Cold War. So in the 90s and the 2000s, really, there was a lot of loss of capability. And so it's not surprising that in the last 10 and 15 years, Russia has been trying to rebuild its capabilities in the Arctic and build new ones. And so they have built out airfields, radar capabilities, they have put in some weapon systems, they have added military garrisons, small ones, they've built airfields, and it makes sense, right? This is a new area of vulnerability. These are high value natural resources that are crucial to their economic prosperity in the future. And they want to secure these resources, and they want to be able to monitor ship traffic in the region and control it. But because it's Russia and they're doing lots of very problematic things around the world, including in Ukraine, we are uncomfortable with the level of military activity that's going on here because it's accompanied by belligerent rhetoric and because it's in the context of all the other disruptive activities that Russia is engaging in. And so it creates a challenge for United States policymakers to figure out what type of activity by Russia in the Arctic is okay and what's not okay, and to talk with our allies in the region, including our close NATO allies, Norway, Denmark, Canada, and Iceland, and NATO partners, Sweden and Finland, about what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A for sure. The last country I want to talk about is China, which is also interested in the Arctic, although not as much as Russia, not even close. China is interested in the Arctic. It's interested in most parts of the world right now. China is a resource importing country. It imports raw materials. It exports finished materials. It has to import food and energy and a lot of basic goods. The Arctic region has a lot of resources, and so China is interested in the Arctic. They have a couple of icebreakers. They're building some more. These icebreakers are used for marine scientific research. Obviously, that research is going to be serving a bunch of different uses because under the system, the government system in China, there's very little distinction between government and non-government activities. The Chinese government is also working to establish cooperative research programs around the Arctic region, including with a lot of the Nordic countries. And so they're gaining an increased amount of economic and diplomatic and scientific presence. And again, sort of given the broader context of China's actions around the world, that's getting a lot of attention and raises a lot of difficult questions for the US and its allies about the appropriate way to engage and dialogue with this growing Chinese interest and presence. Again, happy to take more questions about that if you're interested. Greenland is getting a ton of interest. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. It's an enormous island. It has a lot of natural resources there. The Greenlanders want to be independent, and there's about 56,000 people in Greenland. It's currently dependent on a large block grant from the Danish government every year. A lot of Greenlanders see their natural resources as a path to financial independence that would lead to political independence from Denmark. It's a long road, and you can imagine being a country of 56,000 people would be very challenging. So I would see Greenlandic independence as a very future prospect. And the Danish government is working with Greenland to increase their autonomy within the kingdom. And so the Danish government has been granting more and more autonomy to Greenland over the last several years to give them a greater measure of freedom without sort of 100% freedom, which would be challenging for the Greenlandic government right now. So that's another interesting thing we can talk about if you're interested. The last point I want to make here is just that what's going on in the Arctic is a really interesting and complicated mix of climate change, changing the physical environment, technology change, changing things like how militaries operate, how people communicate, how easy it is to get around, and then also political change, which is affecting relationships, like the political change that's happening in Greenland, for example. And so it's really important to think about all these three perspectives when we think about what's going on in the Arctic, because there's these different streams of change and they're all intersecting and affecting each other in that region. And it's really fascinating, which is one of the reasons I enjoy studying it. And I enjoy talking with you about it, because I think this is just a fascinating laboratory. And it gives us a really interesting challenge, because climate change is happening faster here than anywhere else. And we're also struggling to manage how we relate to the rise of China and sort of the ongoing relationship with Russia and their relationship among the two of them. So we have this new sort of great power competition context, and we also have this terrible problem of climate change, and they collide in the Arctic region. And so it's sort of one of our first early test cases for how well we can manage these two challenges. So I think it's really interesting. I'm happy to take your questions. Those are my slides. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop sharing and look forward to seeing what kind of questions you have for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Becca. That was like, I only realized through your presentation how little I actually know about the Arctic. So I'm super grateful that we're getting the opportunity to hear from you today. I do have some questions from the members prior to registration. I don't see anybody's entered a question in the chat yet, but typically we'll see sometimes that momentum builds. So I'm just going to remind everyone that we've only got about 10 minutes here with Becca. So if you've got a question, go ahead and get it in now. I'll start with the stuff that came in prior to the webinar here, though. So you talked about how Canada and Russia are controlling a lot of the shipping lanes. Russia is kind of coordinating the international efforts in the area. You talked about how maritime law determines how far beyond the land borders countries can claim economic control. Richard Cobalt had asked before the presentation, who has governmental jurisdiction over the Arctic? It sounds like that's not at all a simple question.
It's
like
not.
If somebody asks you that, what would you say?
So one thing that's important to realize, because I get a lot, the Arctic Ocean, so it's an ocean, and it's at the center of the region, and then there's 8 sovereign states around it. And so the 8 sovereign states control their own territory, and that includes 200 nautical miles offshore for economic purposes. So that gets you sort of what we would think of as the donut, right? And then there's the center of the donut, which is the Central Arctic Ocean, and that is high seas, where anything goes. No, but where there is no sovereign, it's high seas. There are international treaties that control what you can and cannot do on the high seas, but there is no sort of global policeman, and no one owns the high seas. Lying under that area of high seas is the seabed, and that's subject to these extended continental shelf claims. Not all of it, but a lot of it. None of those have been resolved yet. And so depending on the resolution of those claims, some coastal state might have the ability to control the resources in the seabed. But right now those claims are unresolved. And again, there's sort of nobody interested in accessing the seabed right now. So the answer is that there is no sort of global authority. There's sovereign state, sovereign territory in the Arctic. And then in the Central Arctic Ocean, in that donut hole, you have high seas. I hope that answers the question.
It does. And I think that's part of what I was so surprised by from your presentation is, I mean, at least for me, it's solid and it's ice. So I always thought of it as kind of its own place. I never thought of it in terms of like, it's an ocean and it's not land that somebody would claim. It's just solid because it's ice. And so it's an interesting way to think about it that just, I don't know, never occurred to me before, I guess. John Mikulski.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
I was going to say there's some fascinating legal debates about whether sea ice is land or water. And there are different legal opinions.
So John Mikulski had asked about and you talked about Russia, new Russian military bases in the Arctic. You talk about expanded airfields and that presence. You also talked about the international response. And maybe you addressed it a little bit, but could you maybe just specifically talk about the how the U.S. reacts to that presence and what we're doing with our military presence in the area?
Sure. So the U.S. has so the state of Alaska, right? Part of what makes the U.S. an Arctic nation, and the state of Alaska has a lot of military assets there, and that's not necessarily because of the Arctic per se, more sort of the global position that we get from base in the Arctic. Because if you think about, the Earth as a globe, and you think about sort of missile vectors that would either sort of come into the United States or go out, being up in Alaska is a short route for a lot of places in Europe and Asia. And so it's a short route for a lot of those places coming towards us as well, right? So the Arctic, Alaska is kind of forward out from a homeland perspective. And so we have a lot of homeland defense oriented military in Alaska, like 4Rs that watch for income threats, like F-35s. We're putting a lot of F-35s in Alaska. We have a large US Army contingent there, mostly Air Force and Army. And that's in recognition of this sort of homeland defense orientation. The Navy doesn't have a large presence in Alaska because of the sea ice issue, although they're starting to sort of take more interest in the region. And I would note that the Navy runs submarines through the Arctic as part of its biannual ICEX exercise and has been doing that for decades. The U.S. Coast Guard has a very large presence because it's a lot of coastline and it's a huge fishing nation or state, sorry. And so the Coast Guard maintains a lot of assets in Alaska, and we don't have as much presence as Russia because there's not as much sort of going on there, but we are building additional icebreakers to support Coast Guard presence in Alaska and the Arctic. We should have a new hull in the next couple of years, and it's looking like we'll probably buy a couple more after that, which is great because we need more icebreakers. We don't need as many as Russia. Obviously, Russia has this big long coastline and they are trying to develop it into an international shipping route, and their icebreakers support commercial traffic and ours don't. So we'll never have as many, and that is totally fine because we shouldn't, but we are building some more, which is going to be great. It'll help the Coast Guard. And we're seeing all of the military services take a closer look at what's going on in the Arctic and in Alaska to see if they need new capabilities or need to build those out. And obviously that has to be done in balance with other priorities, like the Indo-Pacific, because there's sort of one net pool of assets and resources, and you have to spread them out according to priority, but it's definitely getting a lot more attention.
And there was definite interest in that. Both Carol Kirshner and John Mikulski, our members here, asked about the availability of U.S. icebreakers and if we're building new icebreakers, which you just addressed. Well, so let me ask, we've just got a couple minutes here. I'm just going to ask these last couple of questions. I'm curious about the global warming. You mentioned that it was happening faster than expected and also faster than the rest of the planet. So is it catching up or is it jumping ahead?
The dynamics are happening faster than we had expected. So like what we're seeing, our observations now are ahead of what we had expected, which means that our models didn't, we were too conservative in some of our assumptions. And, we're learning more and more about how to improve our models so we can make better forecasts. I think one thing that we didn't quite understand well enough in the Arctic is the way in which we're seeing stronger storms. And that's, we're seeing stronger storms around the world, right? We're seeing stronger storms in the lower US right now. But that's happening up in the Arctic also. And because there's less sea ice protecting the surface of the water, those storms are creating a lot more churn. And that churn breaks up the sea ice further and it increases coastal erosion. And so that has, I think, caused some of our models to not be quite as accurate. And so there's a real concern, when we think about tipping points Arctic sea ice would be a major tipping point, and we're on a really bad trajectory right now. It's you know, it's a crisis. No other way of putting it.
And if we weren't tight on time, I'm sure we could spend a whole nother hour just on that topic, which, maybe you can come back and we'll do that. I think it's an important topic. So let me just ask one last question. I know we're running out of time here, but still with global warming. So the melting of the ice cap is making trade easier, which creates, economic and military incentives in the area. What does that do? It creates those opportunities in the area. What does it do to the economic and military incentives to either address or ignore global warming?
Great question, right? Because obviously there's a lot of oil and gas in the Arctic, and if we are going to transition away from those fuels, maybe we need to think carefully about how much of it, right, we start to bring to market. And that's where one of the challenges is so clear, because different countries think about this problem differently. And Russia is great with a lot of oil and gas that makes its living on selling oil and gas. And so thinking about how to talk to Russia about Arctic oil and gas is really, absent some sort of technological miracle, we'll be in a really bad place. And, in the United States, we have increasingly transitioned to sort of, fracking and shale gas, and we're doing a lot more domestic energy production down in the central west regions, the sort of plain states. Interest in oil and gas. This is a really interesting question: the future of Arctic energy resources versus, and sort of how we balance that with this need for an energy transition. I will also say there's a lot of rare earth elements in the Arctic, and rare earth elements are important to things like solar panels for the energy transition as well, because of those rare earths. But the question about sort of oil and gas versus other types of resources is really important. And I'm glad you brought it up, because there's so much excitement about Arctic oil and gas. And it's like, wait, we have to remember this climate change problem.
Yeah, maybe not killing the planet could be taken into account too. So we're out of time. I am so glad you were able to join us today. This was a super informative presentation. I know it's a tight schedule for you today. I'm very grateful that you carved some time out for us. And I will turn the meeting over to our president, Dr. Saul Lausch, for some closing words.
Well, let me say also thank you again, Rebecca. Very, very informative. And yeah, there's a whole topic we could look at with oil and natural gas. Is it really going to make a big difference 30 or 40 or 50 years ago? From now, we may not be using that, but we'll have to see. So thank you again very, very much. So folks, before I get to our upcoming programs, this is the time of year when we are also engaging in our annual membership renewal, or inviting people, especially at this point in time, to join us as members in our of the organization of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. Many of you listening today, perhaps most, have received our invitation to renew or to join through a mailing that we sent out about to maybe 600 people, 2 or 3 within the past 2 weeks, rather. So we're hoping you have that information. And we want to thank those of you who have already renewed or have become a member for the first time. And thank you to those who have included an additional donation as part of the renewal. Membership is our lifeblood as an organization, as it is with any organization. It supports our program presentations where we have costs, benefits our members generally, and it certainly benefits students and the community at large. If you are considering becoming a member and have not yet, or perhaps have misplaced the information we sent you, we have a simple solution. Go to our website, www.wacreading.org, and most of you know that. When you're there, click on Join Us and scroll down to the blue box to provide us your contact information underscore that and indicate you're interested in our membership application, we will promptly provide you a card to be filled out and returned to us. So thank you for listening to this sales pitch for membership. Upcoming in the next 6 weeks, 2 programs to note that are set. Reflections on Living in the Middle East as a Journalist with Jason Casper. Firsthand set of reporting on his experiences of living in the Middle East. Mr. Casper is a writer and researcher with the Arab West Report, which is based in Cairo. He serves as a local correspondent for Christianity Today and blogs regularly on Egyptian politics, religion, and culture at a sense of belonging. Jason has worked previously in Mauritania, Jordan, and Tunisia, and he holds an MA in Islamic Studies from Columbia International University. I think the real interest for us here is to have this firsthand report from someone now stationed there in the Middle East and has been there for many years. And in August, that upcoming, incidentally, I don't think I gave the date for that. Of course, that's a week from today. That is for July 21 at noon. Then upcoming in August, we have 1 presentation scheduled at this point, and that may be what we have in August because of the many people who are on vacation. An old friend of ours returns, Run Graneri. Run is a Templeton Fellow with the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia and Executive Director of the Institute's Center for the Study of America and the West. He is going to be talking to us about the upcoming German election. Should be of great interest to all of us. And for the first, in 12 years or so, Angela Merkel is not a candidate to be renominated to head the German government. And we'll see what that plays out there. And it's a very important issue. And Run is a specialist in contemporary German and international history. And again, he has presented to us, I think this will be perhaps his 4th or 5th time, and he's always very informed and very interested to hear. So that's our upcoming programming.
Hey, Saul, can I just mention, we also have upcoming tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. our WAC Trivia Live events. We've got 4 or 5 pretty strong regulars there. If anybody would like to jump in, they're welcome to.
Thank you, Mike. I neglected to say that. Mike has been offering this to us now for the past, 4, 5, 6 months. And he works hard at putting that together. I participated one time. I had not participated recently, but it's a lot of fun for those who are engaged. So thank you, Mike, for that. May I just say finally, folks, that we're pointing to have a return to our live luncheon programs in October. Tentatively, it'll be October 20. So keep your ears tuned to that as we report more on that. And if we do, on the date as tentatively scheduled, it'll be a topic about China and the turmoil there with Hong Kong. So there we are, folks. Thank you, Mike Sutton, as always, for leading this. Mike is our person who handles all of our programming of this nature here online and does a wonderful job with it. We really appreciate it. He handles the technology, and then he serves as a superb host. So thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to our program committee, headed by Dave Bean, for continuing to work hard to put these programs together. Have a good day, everyone.